This question asks, how do you determine whether the fidgeting behavior is anxiety-based versus pain-based? Is that where you would do a pain med trial to assess? So this is a great question. Let's start by defining some of our terms. So we are talking, when we're talking about fidget response, specifically here, I have been talking about it in line with red zone levels of arousal, toxic levels of stress. So we're talking about what we typically think of as like fight and flight level stress responses. But originally in this conversation, we were talking about some of those lesser recognized or harder to recognize responses that are right up there with fight or flight, fawn, fidget, and freeze. So we're talking about fidget in that context, although we can certainly see fidget behaviors lower on the stress scale to cope with stress. But here we're talking about sort of that red zone response. It's often mistaken for overexcitement. We see a lot of jumping, licking, fast, frantic, fidgety behaviors, physiological signs of arousal, difficulty processing information, fine motor skills are offline. Potentially the digestive system is offline. Then there's a separate thing that I kind of started talking about in this last video. And then those things are going to merge. So another thing separate from the fidget response is that sometimes when dogs are painful, they will engage in hyper-aroused behavior. So you might have a dog, I specifically often see this in dogs that are experiencing sort of chronic pain, or maybe have been by the time, we're visiting with me and talking about it. These are the dogs that are, impossible to tire out. They need so much exercise. They don't really, if you're not looking at the screen, I'm doing air quotes, but that's how it seems, because exercise can be a distraction from pain. It releases endorphins, which can act as a temporary pain reliever. And so sometimes dogs deal with pain by becoming more active, which is sort of the opposite of what we would expect. That on its own is not necessarily the same thing as a fidget response, but we know that our dogs who are experiencing behavior concerns often are also experiencing pain. The majority of the time, pain is involved either directly or indirectly, meaning that sometimes the pain is a direct result. The dog has an ear infection, someone touches the dog's ear, the dog bites the person because they were touched where they're painful. But what I see a lot more often in my work is that pain is an underlying contributing factor to the dog's inability to cope with triggers and cope with the world. And it's sort of a chicken and an egg thing, right? Has the dog always been painful or been painful for a long time and then has sort of developed anxiety and other mental health concerns? Or is the pain feeding something that was already there due to early environment or genetics? Not that pain is not linked to genetics and early environment, right? So it's all blending together here. So let's say that I have a dog who is generally okay with people, doesn't love when they like touch and reach and handle her, but is not generally fearful of them. Now maybe you have that same dog who is painful, and so they are now having a harder time dealing with stressors in general, but particularly the stressor of people potentially touching them because they're painful. So now, instead of being, in like a yellow zone on the stress scale and coping by just walking away from the people, they are higher on the stress scale, less able to access their coping skills, more flooded with stress hormones, and we see a fidget response. Or you could replace people with a thunderstorm. So when our dogs feel painful in their body or uncomfortable or unwell, it is impacting their ability to deal with stressors. And that's why in a behavior case, our first stop is always to check out if the dog is experiencing pain, while recognizing that pain often does not appear the way we expect it to show up. And so if our dog is experiencing high levels of distress, either through the fidget response or because we're just like, man, you are just hyper aroused and showing these patterns of like, this restlessness and this inability to settle down. Either way, the first thing we want to do is check things out at the vet. And how that goes might depend on a lot of different factors. Sometimes it's a pain med trial. Sometimes it's a diagnostics. It kind of just depends on the individual vet and the individual dog and what's going on.